Hi, everyone, and welcome to this month's Executive Forum's Expert Insight. I'm Kirian Koza. I'm the Global Operations and Member Experience Director with Executive Forums. It is my absolute pleasure to be with you here today, and I am joined by our esteemed speaker, Dr. Stephanie D. Barnes, who I'm going to introduce in just a few moments. In honor of International Women's Month, we are going to be talking about bias today, and specifically gender bias. So, as leaders, as many of our members are leaders and CEOs and presidents and owners of company, decision-making lies at the heart of your professional lives. Every day you're making decisions. Some are small and innocuous, but many others are important, strategic, affecting your business, people's lives, livelihoods, and well-being. Only 2% of our biases come from our conscious. That means 98% of our biases are coming from our unconscious state. This daunting reality means that enormously important decisions made by intelligent, responsible leaders with the best information and intentions are sometimes flawed. We are all aware of the enormous benefits now of inclusion and diversity or gender balance initiatives within our organizations. In McKinsey's latest report on the matter, it states, again, gender, ethnic, cultural diversity, particularly within executive teams, continues to be correlated to financial performance across multiple countries worldwide. So leaders understand the proof that now exists. So why aren't we seeing more impact? And bias certainly is playing a role. So with the great resignation looming, talent shifts, generational shifts, understanding how to change behaviors and consciously unbiasing ourselves as leaders will give a strategic upper hand in decision-making and hopefully drive more impact and action to push forward gender balance, diversity, and all of those correlated benefits. So the question is, how do we become consciously unbiased? Looking in the mirror is a very daunting task, especially when we're looking at ourselves in an unflattering light. How can we as leaders approach these uncomfortable topics like our own failures and our own unconscious bias with intention? So how do we become an example, a driving force for inclusive leadership, and why does that matter? Here with us to share their thought leadership on the matter is Dr. Stephanie D. Barnes. We're going to talk disrupting unconscious bias with conscious decisions, breaking down how bias disrupts business, shifting from awareness to action. Dr. Barnes is a Harvard-educated attorney, an award-winning author, and an expert on leadership, gender equality, and women's rights. She has been featured in the Harvard Business Review, Personal Excellence Magazine, and the Huffington Post. She is an internationally acclaimed and TEDx speaker, coach, and is the host of the podcast, Living Life in the And. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Barnes. Welcome, and please, the stage is yours.
Well, good day, everyone. It's so good to be here. And I'm so excited to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is, how to get more people at the table, more women at the table, and how do we disrupt those environments around us to make a change. So I'm going to share my screen just so you can have a little visual to go along with what I have to share. And let me get that. And I don't know if you can hear in the background, but it's raining here in Atlanta, Georgia. So hopefully we won't have any disruptions of that kind. So let me get back. Let's see. Making sure that you can see it. Let's see. Give me just a moment. All right, as I bring up the slides, I will, there we go. Window, there we go. Okay. It's, of course. Now this went so smoothly as we did our practice, but of course, in reality, sometimes that doesn't happen. So give me a moment and we will get this up. But as I am getting the screen to work, I will share with you just some stats. We have just celebrated International Women's Day. And of course, it is much a part of, there we go, the much larger celebration of International Women's Day or International Women's Month. And I just want to put some things in perspective as we discuss how we can break the bias. And this is sharing all kinds of things. I'm going to get this screen share correct. Don't you worry. But so here's some things that I want to us to focus on. You know, the theme for International Women's Day was breaking the bias, and we have to really think about, what does that mean, breaking the bias? And if we're going to shift, we need to know where we're starting from. So here's some tips or just some data that I want to share with you. All right, here we go. So the World Economic Forum Gender Gap Report produces a global gap index yearly, and it shares the gap basically between men and women across four fundamental indices. They look at economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. Now, here's something that I want you to understand as to why this is so important for us to be able to break the bias. In order for the gap between men and women to close, or the time that it will take for the gap between men and women to close across all four of these indices takes over 135 years, almost 136 years. So that means that none of us, regardless of how well we take care of ourselves, will see the gap close. So we've lost ground. Women have lost ground because when I looked at this report last year, the gap was projected to close in 99.5 years. And now an additional 35 years has been added to that. So if we are going to close this gap, we've got to do more than just making incremental gains. We've got to make major gains. So, again, I want to share some other things to kind of put this in context. Because, on the one hand, it looks as if we are making gains. Like here in the US, we have just seen the election of our first woman vice president, and President Biden's cabinet has women in many key leadership positions. Across the country, we have five women leading countries. And over history, there have been 70 countries that have had women at the head of state. In the US, or just even across the world, 41% of the Fortune 5 with 45 women lead Fortune 500 companies. And even though 41 is a pretty significant number in the whole scheme of things, that's only 8.2%. So it's a very small fraction. And in the US, there are only 37 female CEOs, the 37 female and 463 male chiefs. So there's chief financial officer, chief operating officer, and so forth, those in the C suite. And those were just the numbers among businesses that were captured in this survey. So I want you to think about that in contrast to kind of where's the pool? Where are these women coming from? So in one study that looked at MBA participants, women account for about 41%. And there is a pool from which to draw. So why are we not seeing that correlation in the C-suite? Women account for about 50% of the US population, hold about 57% of undergraduate degrees and 60% of master's degrees. So women are getting education. Again, that's just one subset. Why are we not seeing that in the C-suite? We continue to have this gap remain. And as I shared, 136 years for that global gap. to close. We have the women who are represented in the pools where theoretically these leaders can come, but we don't see them show up in the C suite. So, what I want us to focus on today is how do we disrupt this? How do we move the needle so that we are able to actually see change happen in our lifetime. So we can't just talk about it because International Women's Month is just one month. International Women's Day is just one day. And certainly it's great to have awareness. Certainly it's great to talk about the themes each year, but how do we make sure that from year to year, from month to month, that we're actually seeing that change? Because what we hope is that in 2022, we don't see a loss as we did moving from 2020 to 2021. Remember, we went from 99.5 years to close that gap to over 135 years. So if we are diligent in making these disruptions, we will be able to actually move the needle and close that gap in our lifetime. So I'm going to try one more time. This, like I said, this worked perfectly when we did our our run through, but it is not doing what we need it to do right now. And if we can't, I can talk without the slides because this is something again that I am passionate about, and the slides are just a way to um, augment what I share with visuals. All right, let's
Hi,
see.
Dr. Stephanie. Good to
Yes.
see you there. We are seeing your screen. Just make sure that you're going straight to your PowerPoint. You won't be able to see StreamYard, but you can see your
Okay,
PowerPoint.
that's what I okay.
Perfect.
All right. Because I'm like, I can't see myself anymore. All right, so here we go. Here we go.
Perfect.
All right, you see it?
We're still seeing your StreamYard. Are you?
Oh, you don't see the screen? Okay.
Just some
Yeah.
tech issues.
Yes, that's okay. So as I work through these tech issues, like I say, worked so perfectly when we did our run through, but sometimes that doesn't always go. But I'm going to start with the first question as I multitask and talk to you about what is a bias. You know, we want to really put this concept because as we shared, about 98% of what we do are these on is driven by unconscious bias. But what is a bias and what does it mean in the context of our businesses, and how does it show up? A bias at its root is just where you prefer one thing over another, you prefer one person over another. And of course, gender bias is where you prefer one gender over another. And we it is natural for us to prefer to work with, to be around people who have our shared experiences. And that in and of itself is not a harmful activity. But when doing so does not allow us to have the full breadth of a great team, or it is excluding others who would otherwise be able to add to what we do, then it has a harmful effect on our businesses. So here's some impacts, some things I want you to think about as to how gender bias impacts us negatively as women, how it ultimately negatively impacts the businesses that we have. So here's some stats I want to share with you. In a study done by McKinsey, the results show that 42% of women experience gender discrimination at work. 5 of the 14 top barriers that women face in the workplace are related to discrimination and gender bias. Both men and women are twice as likely to hire a male candidate. And that's where you see where preferring one gender over another has real impacts. Because, when I shared those stats about the pool from which you can draw people, you know, obviously there are women who are capable, but why aren't they being pulled in? Here's another stat I want to share with you. Women are 79% or 79 times more likely to be hired when there are at least two female candidates in the finalist pool. So getting that mass, that critical mass is important. And here's something interesting to show how bias impacts women in particular. Women are 25 to 46% more likely to be hired when it's a blind application or audition. So when the gender is not obvious, there is a greater likelihood that women will be selected because these biases don't come into play. Well, we know that in the workplace, you can't do a blind selection. There is this obvious knowledge about the gender of the other party. So, we want to think about, well, what exactly is this unconscious bias? What is conscious bias versus unconscious bias? And, as I mentioned, we all have inherent biases. And as social beings, as human beings, we are driven to connect with each other through our social connections. There's a lot of research around the impact of how we come together as social creatures. And so, because this is an innate part of who we are, our social connections tend to drive our other decisions. And these unconscious biases, by definition, is an unintentional and automatic mental association based on gender. And this is often driven by traditions, by norms, societal norms, values, cultural influences, and our experiences. So when we don't take when we are not intentional about breaking those biases, then we are subconsciously allowing those biases to drive our decisions. So here's some other stats to kind of emphasize what I mean by this. 40% of men and women notice a double standard against female candidates. Women who negotiate for raises and promotions are 30% more likely to be considered as too aggressive or intimidating. Men view unconscious bias. This is interesting. Men view unconscious bias as a number one barrier that women face in their careers. So, again, this is an interesting acknowledgement that, men's just preconceived notions or mental associations with women as leaders influences their tendency to develop these crucial relationships that allow women to be in positions that enable them to move through the ranks. So here's something that's also interesting. I've done a lot of research on this. Gender bias doesn't always come from men. Women leaders and peers can perpetuate it too. In fact, there is this phenomenon called the queen bee syndrome, where women are intentional in their bias against other women. Now, some of this is driven by this kind of fear or conditioning about, well, I've made it to the top. I've overcome the bias. If it appears I show favoritism, then I'll lose my spot. Some of it is this intentional perpetuation of the bias that, where they are harder on other women or don't feel that the other women can lead, even though they have. So that's a really, really great and interesting research around this queen bee phenomenon. And I did a TEDx talk back in 2016 where I talked about how these unconscious biases are prevalent in how we see women as leaders. And I focus specifically on the discourse that we use, how we describe leadership, because for many years, leadership characteristics have been categorized as either masculine or feminine. And masculine leadership attributes are being decisive, being great communicators. All of the heralds of great leadership have been attributed to this masculine category. Whereas those attributes that are more relational, compassion, empathy, collaboration, are considered to be feminine leadership traits. Now, what does this do? What it does is it creates this bias against women, because if women exercise decisiveness, are very straightforward and direct, well, because that is a masculine characteristic, the woman is penalized for exhibiting great leadership. And it goes the other way as well. So when men are collaborative or empathetic or compassionate, well, they're not being a good leader. So, one of the things that we have to learn to do to overcome our unconscious bias and to confront the biases that we face and disrupt in gender terms, rather than saying that these leadership attributes are masculine or feminine. Just recognize that leadership attributes come from our strategic skills as well as our relational skills, and those skills are good for both genders. So what I want to do is just ask you, what are some of the things that you're seeing in your environments? Because I'd love to hear from you. And if you can share in the chat, in the environments that you work in, what are you seeing more of? Are you seeing more conscious bias where people are being overt in their desires to relegate women or men to one area or another, or not to allow women to advance into managerial? Or are you seeing this unconscious bias where it's not a policy, it's not an antagonistic environment per se, it's not a hostile um, um, confrontation or a conflict with women, but simply it is the numbers are showing that this unconscious bias is prevalent. So if you're seeing that, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you can share that in the chat. What do you see more of in your environments? What have been your experiences? Have you experienced an overt bias, again, where it's expressed, it is intentional, or are you seeing more impact coming from unconscious bias? And while you are doing that, I'm going to try one more time to pull in these slides. And I tell you what, because let's see, we're going to try it this way. All right. So hopefully we can get it to share this time, but if not, we will keep on. Okay. All right. It's uploading. So as we're doing that, I want to now shift into the next part. So once you are aware, self-awareness is so very important, because it's important that you know bias when you see it. It's important that you understand how biases are impacting you. And it's important to be able to recognize when you are participating in bias, because in allowing and perpetuating biases. So, when are, you have to often ask, how do you see yourself as a leader? As a woman, how do you see yourself as a leader? How do you interact with other women leaders as compared to other male leaders? Are you treating them differently, or are you noticing that the interactions are different? So as you, there, I think you should be able to see it. And if
Yes,
There we
we
go.
have your PowerPoint.
See, yes, if at once you don't succeed, try again. I am indeed like the little
What a
choo-choo, and
great
that's
lesson.
an American story, but great. So we have it showing. All right. So what I want to encourage all of us to think about is how can we be a disruption? And a disruption is not a negative thing. A disruption is simply a break or interruption in the normal course or continuation of an activity. So, if we desire to truly break the bias, then we have to be a disruption. We have to encourage disruptions, and those disruptions will lead to change. So we break unconscious bias when we make conscious decisions to shift from awareness. Okay, I know what bias is. I know it's important to break the bias. I know that the bias is 136. It would the gap between men and women will take 136 years to close. So now what do we do? So let's look at how bias actually disrupts business because the it shows up in very innocuous ways, and until we recognize this as leaders and also as participants, we're not going to be able to make that shift from awareness to action. So the biggest, or one of the biggest areas that may not seem obvious as being impactful in getting women in leadership positions is gender bias can influence mentors and mentorship opportunities. Because we have to recognize, remember, I said we are social beings, we connect with each other through our relationships. Well, hiring decisions, promotion decisions, all of these things are driven by relationships. Well, if women aren't being mentored in the same way as their male counterparts, they don't get these relationships that enable them to get the important assignments that allow them to grow their leadership skills. So, what this results is in a gender bias being embedded in company practices and structures. So, it will show up in performance evaluations. Because remember, if a woman exercising good leadership skills, being divisive, being decisive, being direct, being a strong communicator, being a great implementer. If there is a bias against a woman exhibiting those characteristics, well, she won't get the high marks on her performance review. If she's more collaborative and has a more compassionate style, then she may not be rewarded for that because that may not be seen as strong leadership. So, this is a very real way that gender bias shows up in performance reviews. The project assignments, again, if you don't have those relationships, then you won't be able to gain the operational skills that you need to be able to move up and throughout the company. Also, the lack of leadership development programs or the inability of leadership development programs to actually have a connection to getting women in leadership positions. And overall, where the biases prevent these relationships from being developed, women will have fewer interactions with the senior leaders who are making the decisions about who gets promoted and who gets the ability to expand. So let's just share a few more stats. 77% of women say that the biggest obstacle to gender equity in their workplace is the lack of information on how to advance. You don't know what you don't know. Because even though there may be some things that are formally discussed about how to get ahead in the organization, there may be some activities and relationships and sponsorships, and that's when there is a senior leader who actively ensures that a junior person moves along in the company. When you don't know how to do that, or if you don't know that there's an unspoken rule that you need to do these things over a period of time in order to be considered, well, then you're not going to be well positioned. Here's another stat that I think is illustrative for this point. Only 41% of female survey participants, as opposed to 64% of their male counterparts, said that they have a network of coaches, mentors, and sponsors offering them their career guidance. So when the bias is against building these relationships or doesn't really allow these relationships to gel, women don't get in the positions where they are able to advance. So here's some other ways that gender bias has an impact on business relationships and performance, ultimately performance. So in a study that looked at male versus female CEO statistics, this was done in 2020, 39% of senior level women had or expressed a concern with burnout or expressed that they were having burnout compared to 29% of the men. 34% of women in this study felt pressure to work more in comparison to 27% of men. And at the same time, 54% of the C-suite women reported that they constantly felt exhausted as compared to about 41% of their male counterparts. So what is the significance of this burnout? We've heard about, the great resignation, and we've seen how that is resulting in many people, women included, leaving the workforce. And when there is not this ability to progress or this feeling that I'm on this hamster wheel and I'm not going to be able to progress, well, it has a real impact on how people perform. It's hard to perform at your highest level when you're suffering burnout or when you're feeling that there's not a end result to the hard work that you're doing, or you feel that regardless of how hard you work, you're not going to really get ahead. All of these things impact how people show up at work. And the real result for businesses is you lose good talent. And so all of these practices, that impact mentorship, that impact relationships and network building and access to information about how to get ahead, widens the gap between men and women. So we have to be very honest about how bias disrupts performance, because gender bias disrupts performance, because when we see where women are not able to get into the leadership pipeline, or when they leave the company altogether, there is a real financial impact to not having good numbers in retention, having high attrition, having high turnover. And from a performance perspective, you aren't able to get the full optimization of the talent you have in your pool. So we've got a comment over here. Let's see. All right. Yeah, yes, so and this is especially prevalent, in the STEM technologies, and even though again there's this access to education, there still is not, in terms of the numbers, a correlation between women entering the pool of talent and women who actually enter the C-suite. So one of the things that I'd love to learn from you, if you can share it, if you feel free to share it in the comments, is, how do you see bias impacting your talent pipeline in terms of you being able to get into the leadership pipeline? And those of you who have gotten to the C-suite, how have you seen bias be a deterrent or an obstacle? Obviously, you've overcome it, but how do you ensure that there are more women in the leadership pipeline so that, you can practice or be in your industry for 20 years and see more than one woman leader? Because that is what the numbers show, is that, again, there is this huge gap between the number of women who are in the talent pipeline, those who make it into the leadership pipeline, and those who actually make it to those leadership positions. So let's think about, you know, how do we disrupt these patterns so that it's more than just one? And I love this illustration that really gives us a good visual for how it ends up being. And it's so apropos for the comment that has been shared about, being in this industry for 20 years and seeing one. How do we ensure that it's more than just one who who makes it through that pipeline? So in order to do this, we have to shift from awareness to action. And as leaders, we have to begin to actively root out bias. I love this saying by Maya Angelou, a poet and writer. Do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better. So I don't think that any of us can honestly say that as an industry, or just as a business community, or even as peers, that we are unaware that bias is out there. You may not have particular stats, and you may not have all of this research, but you can look around the room, look around the table, and look at the numbers of those women who actually make it to those leadership positions to see that there is not a correlation between the number of women in the talent pipeline and those who make it to the top. So now that we know better, how can we do better? As I mentioned, we first have to recognize our own bias. Okay, and we have to understand when we are perpetuating a bias against ourselves. I'm not going to speak up because I don't want to be seen as too aggressive, or I'm going to judge this woman more harshly because she is being assertive. We have to understand that. But we also have to begin to challenge those around us. And I remember when this became very obvious for me that, I had to be the change I wished to see. When I was a healthcare executive in a health system, I was the only woman was the only one. And as I looked around at my male counterparts, I recognized that, well, there are other women in this organization who ought to. I shared earlier, I'm having their thunderstorms here and I lost power for a minute. So I apologize, but I'm back. So I am, if you want to see persistence in human form, that's me today. I will not be deterred in sharing this message with you. And I appreciate your patience as we have gone through the technical challenges that are attempting to disrupt this message today. So I'm going to bring the slides back up and just continue on because I was sharing with you how I began to recognize that I could be a disruption or disruptor in a positive way to begin to break the bias. And when I was an executive, because I'm not sure where I went out when the power went out, so I'll just start over with the story. But when I was an executive, I was literally sitting around the table and recognized that I was the only woman at the table, and we were about to embark upon this massive system-wide project. And it required a time commitment that was greater than what the entire senior team could do. So we had to bring others on. And as we started to assign different components of the project, I was conscious of who was being selected. And it was the same 5 guys, and these were great leaders, great emerging leaders, but it was the same 5 men, literally, that were always picked. And I asked the question about, well, why aren't there any women being picked? Why are there only men being picked? And initially, it caught my peers off guard because I didn't ask it in a hostile way, but just asking the question, why aren't we selecting women to lead these projects? Because the reality was that this project was of such great importance to the organization that it would position those who led those individual teams with the ability to make connections throughout the organization, with the ability to really test out their leadership skills, and it would give them visibility. But there were no women being selected. And the answer I got was, well, there are no women that are qualified. And I'm like, I knew that not to be the case because I had some really great emerging leaders that were on my team. And I asked the question, I said, well, don't we have this graduate management program, which is what it was called? I said, we've had this management development program for years. Why are there not any? And women have gone through that, right? I just kept asking questions. Women have gone through that program. Shouldn't there be some women who are qualified to lead these projects from that? And again, some uncomfortable stares, some uncomfortable positioning. And the thing that this emphasized for all of us sitting there is, even though we had a leadership development program, it was still not producing leaders. And it challenged the effectiveness of the efforts of this program. And so I asked later on, went to the CEO with the numbers. I came with the data and I showed, the number of women we had go through the program, which should correlate to a certain number of women who were qualified to lead. And I requested that he give me the permission to develop a leadership program that would specifically develop those skills that would allow women in particular to lead projects and to be elevated into leadership positions. And he listened, and he looked at the numbers. He was a numbers guy. He was an accountant, and he knew I had the passion for it. And we were able to put this leadership development program into place that had about 5 classes, and about 100 women went through the program, and about 20% of those went on to actually become leaders in the organization, some of the VP positions, some of the director positions, and so forth. So even though you may not be the decision maker around leadership, you can be a disruptor. So as we close out, I want to stress the importance of asking tough questions, because asking questions allows people to shift from the way it has always been to, how could it be? So here's some questions that you can ask to develop, to understand your own biases in hiring practices, but also to challenge your peers. Are you working with the same people out of habit? When you're selecting new talent or promoting existing talent, what are some of the things you're considering? Are you selecting the best candidate or the one that you're the most comfortable with? Did you give potential talent a fair chance? Was this a complete pool of people? Was it the right pool? Was it really a pool, or did you just kind of go to the people you always go to? Did you hand select a group of people without really taking the time to make sure you had a diverse pool? Are you ensuring that women are even given the opportunity to interview? Were there any women among those that were chosen to move forward? Are you ensuring that women are included in the activities or relationships that even give them the potential to be qualified? And are you genuine? Is your company genuine in developing qualifications and prerequisites that ensure that have exclusivity, or does it promote inclusiveness? What do the numbers show? How many women do you have in your talent pipeline versus how many are in the leadership pipeline versus how many are actually in leadership positions? Who are you hiring and promoting, and does the roster show diversity? When you do that organizational chart and the headshots are on there, does it look like the diversity in your company? And here's the most important question. If it doesn't, what are you going to do about it? And as I close out, I just want to say this, as leaders, as influencers, even for those who are not at the table yet and want to get there, we have to advocate for intentionality in creating pipelines. You have to make work more sustainable, making sure that you are actually giving people opportunities to use their talent and to develop. Reset norms around flexibility. If one thing the pandemic hasn't shown us is that there is a very innovative ways to get the work done. Taking a closer look at performance reviews. What are you asking? How are they structured? Does the performance review structure have an innate bias in it? Taking steps to minimize gender bias by providing meaningful structures for including a diverse pool of talent. Again, not just looking at the resumes, but looking at the people behind them and making sure that they represent the demographic that you wish to promote. Adjusting your policies and procedures to better support employees, strengthening employee communication. Remember that stat about most women don't even know what it takes to be able to move forward. Creating those formal opportunities for leadership development and sponsorships, having a developed infrastructure to make sure that you have that pipeline flow. Here's something that's really important: measuring it, incorporating diversity goals into performance metrics, because we know if it's not measured, it doesn't gain the importance that it deserves. So put your money where your mouth is, so to speak, and make sure that you're including those in your performance metrics. And then finally, the most important thing is challenging yourself and challenging others to disrupt their own personal biases so that those personal biases don't become an inherent part of your company structure and in performance. So with that, I am going to open it up for questions, and I do look forward to hearing, what questions you may have and how I can assist you with being that disruption.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stephanie. Thanks for being with us. Thank you for your talk, making it through the technical issues. That was good. I think it's so interesting, everything that you've brought to the table here, and I really enjoyed the last part about how do we take our awareness and how do we kind of put that into action. And something that I think would be interesting for you to touch on before we leave is this idea of, we're entering a time when we're going to have 4 generations for the first time ever, I think, working together in the workforce.
Right.
And so I think one of the things I heard you talk a lot about was calling out your own bias, showing yourself as transparent and vulnerable. Sometimes that's really hard as a leader, but we know that the millennials, that the Gen Z, they have a lot more awareness about bias than I think, some of the baby boomers or even Gen X. It's just they've heard it a lot more. It's been much more of a topic. We know that they're very purpose driven. We know that, they're less loyal. They're more driven by opportunity, by the fact that they can advance. So how can you see sort of leaders taking advantage of this intergenerational shift that's happening in the workplace to kind of call out or bring more awareness to these unconscious bias and get that discussion started? I think it's a unique opportunity.
Yes. And, one of the great things that I've observed about, having this generational interaction is there's so much that because I'm a Gen X, part of Gen X, and and because you kind of see the supposed conflict between like baby boomers and millennials and Gen Y. But the biggest lesson that I learned from a millennial was this concept of career advancement and this concept of how we look at things. And the conversation we had circled around, he said, older generations kind of see their careers this ladder. You go here, this step, this step, this step. Millennials, because he was a millennial, see their job opportunities like a jungle gym. And, a jungle gym has all of these different options. You can go up, you can go down, you can swing from the bars, you can, do all of these different things. And that's and that really opened my eyes to how important it is to disrupt my pattern of thinking of things in this sequential manner or just the way they've always been and really open up to innovation. So one of the biggest impacts that having that younger generation who has grown up with access to information, because they can look up the data. We all have the internet now. They have also grown up in a time where they have been encouraged and enabled to disrupt and to ask questions and to confront the things that they wish to have changed, rather than setting that up as a hostile relationship. There's so much information that can be transferred. And I think it's important for leaders who are in the older generations to really learn from the communication styles, just the desire for this transparency and inclusion that millennials and Gen Y is demanding, and learn how to work together, because it's not a us versus them. It is certainly a collaborative environment where we can learn from each other and learn to do more together.
Thank you so much. So there is a question in the chat that is, why does the world need more female leaders? And I think that's, so we've got the business case for it. We've got all of the proof out there, that this is something that's not just great for society, it's actually great for business. But I think that there's also this notion of going back to, and I think maybe because I'm talking about this generational, and this is becoming such a big topic for leadership, these 4 generations working together. I would say that young women coming into the workplace also want to feel seen and heard. They want to see more women leaders out there. We're moving towards not just diversity, not just inclusion, but this idea of gender balance. And how does that impact our decision making, and how does that impact who we're hiring and our talent pools and the ideas that we're moving forward and business opportunities. So I would love to get, just close out on this idea for you as a thought leader in that area. Why does the world need more female leaders?
And I think the answer is based in the fact that, women have, contribute to the to the economy, they contribute to the development of our families, they contribute to the development of commerce. And because they are prevalent in numbers as participants, there ought to be prevalence in their leadership of the areas where they're impacting. I mean, when we look at the numbers, in terms of the number of women, and it's always kind of around 40 to 50%. If there are 40 to 50% of women represented as a participant, then there ought to be a comparable representation of women in leadership. And, we bring more to the table. We bring, when there are women at the table, you get different considerations, and you get just the benefit of their experiences. And I want to be really careful not to inject bias in how I describe what women bring to the table. We're great leaders, just because we are able to contribute to those or exhibit those great leadership skills. But when we are part of the creation of the activities that fuel our economy, that fuel our culture, that fuel the world, we ought to be also represented and not allowed, but empowered to lead, to be able to create more. So in simple words, because we are participants and we are represented numbers wise, we ought to also be leading those activities where we are contributing.
Yeah. So in executive forums, one of the things we say is collective intelligence, and that leads to together with diversity, with diverse thought, with diverse perspectives, we take better decisions. So for society, for our businesses, for our lives. So I think that's a great thought to end with. And thank you so much for being with us today. I hope this has sparked some ideas about bias, our own bias, being vulnerable, putting ourselves out there, addressing it openly with our teams, addressing it openly with our social circles, and asking some hard questions, and hopefully aligning our actions with that awareness. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Thank you, Dr. Stephanie, and see you all again soon. Thank you.
All right, thank you.